Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today we're taking a look at the top 25 original PlayStation games of all time. So the original PlayStation was groundbreaking and had a crap ton of games, more games than you could ever conceivably talk about. Loads of hidden gems, lots of shovelware, plenty of great, fantastic games. Um, But as far as I'm concerned, going through all of the ones I've played or know about, these are the best ones. So we start with number 25, which is Wipeout. Wipeout is more or less the PlayStation answer to F-Zero. It's a futuristic sci-fi racing game, but it's really cool. Now, it was not made by, I believe it was made by Psygnosis, if I'm not mistaken. So they weren't owned by Sony. At least they weren't at the time. I don't know if they are now or were. But they did agree to make Wipeout initially exclusive to the PlayStation, but it was only a timed exclusive, and then it did make its way to Saturn and N64 in some capacity. Number 24 is one of the early 3D platformers, one of the better ones of the period, and a staple in the video game franchise, or video game world, I should say, as a franchise. It is Pac-Man World. Now, subsequent Pac-Man World games would be better than this one, but this was a good first entry and a damn good game you want to own in your PlayStation collection for sure. Number 23 is another 32-bit update to a popular 8-bit slash 16-bit franchise. And this one adds anime-style cartoony full motion videos and voices and stuff. But also gives you save states and things like that to make it a little easier to swallow. This is Mega Man 8, which is one of the best mainline Mega Man games, actually, out there. And then you have number 22, is a PC game that's still getting ported to everything to this day. It's the original Doom. At the time, the PlayStation version was the definitive version of Doom. Now, other better versions would come along down the road, and the definitive version would get ported to other systems later on. But it started on the original PlayStation, and if you have a PlayStation, you're gonna want Doom. It's a damn good game. Number 21 is another. This one comes from the PC. This was a PC CD-ROM game, I believe Windows 95. In fact, I'm not 100%, so don't quote me on that. However, this is more of an adaptation than a port. Just like that game had been adapted to 16-bit consoles, this version is not a straight port. It is MechWarrior 2, which is also subtitled the arcade game. It's more of a action-oriented version of the game than the, I guess, sci-fi sim that the PC version is, but it's still a damn good game. Number 20 is a straight-up arcade port of a fighting game that was super popular for a spell and then just disappeared, which is really strange. It's called Primal Rage, and again, at the time, the PlayStation version, the PS1 version, was the definitive way to get this game at home. Now, immediately following the PlayStation 1, this game was released in a compilation called Midway's Arcade Treasures for PS2, GameCube, Xbox, etc. That just literally gave you the arcade port, the arcade version, the ROM. But before that happened, Primal Rage, the best way to get it at home was on the Sony PlayStation. Number 19 was a trend on the PlayStation. And then it carried over to the Dreamcast and then just sort of fell out of favor for a while. This was taking old retro arcade games from the 70s and 80s and giving them modern updates, modern graphics, modern soundtracks, semi-modern gameplay, etc. This is one of the better attempts at doing that. This game was on multiple systems, but again, we're talking PlayStation, and this is Asteroids. This is the updated 3D graphics version of Asteroids, and it's a really good game. This is a lot of fun. Number 18 is one of the better 3D platformers on the system, and I would argue it's one of the more fully 3D platformers. Some of them are just pseudo 3D or 2.5D, etc. But this one is a straight up 3D platformer like Mario 64, Banjo Kazooie, etc. This is Spyro the Dragon, and it's a fucking awesome game. If you have a PlayStation, you really want to play Spyro the Dragon. Number 17, speaking of pseudo 3D, 2.5D type games, is Crash Bandicoot 2, which is not the best in the franchise, but a good solid entry and still worth owning. And it is definitely a good 3D, fun 3D type platformer. Number 16, we're continuing the trend of classic games updated for modern gameplay. And I think this one does it better than Asteroids. I know I said Asteroids was one of the better ones to do it. This one does it better than Asteroids. This is Frogger, which was actually a really good game on the PlayStation. And I believe it was also on the Dreamcast. It may have been on the Nintendo 64, but I'm not 100%. Next is a unique take on the puzzle game formula. This is the PlayStation version of Tetris, known as Tetris Plus. Now, this one's unique in that you don't just have falling blocks and the same old music and backgrounds, etc. It gives you a theme and kind of a story. You have a little adventurer dude who's trapped in the pyramid, and your goal is to stack the Tetris blocks so that he can get to the door, so he can get out of the so he can get out and go to the next room of the pyramid. This is a very interesting and fun, unique take on Tetris. And there were two of them, Tetris Plus and Tetris Plus 2. But you really only need the first one, because the second one is literally just more of the same. Number 14 was kind of a PlayStation exclusive, in that it was created for the home consoles of the time. But it isn't a PlayStation exclusive, meaning it was on other consoles. But the PlayStation version is the one people played, and it's known as a PlayStation game, even though it wasn't exclusive to PlayStation. This is the original Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, which was like the culmination of the 90s. It was like everything 90s just wrapped up in one video game. It captured 90s youth culture pretty much better than even MTV did at the time. Number 13 is a weird game I was iffy about putting on the list because I've only played it a couple of times. But I had a lot of fun both times I did play it. I do own it, so I'll probably play it again. But it's Klonoa, and it's another pseudo 3D kind of 2.5D platformer type game with some puzzle solving elements. But it's a lot of fun. Straight across, Klonoa versus Saturn's comparable game, Nights into Dreams. I would argue Klonoa is a slightly better game than Nights into Dreams, if you want me to get right on down to it. The Sony PlayStation somehow became known for its JRPGs, and while there were a ton of them on the Super Nintendo, they weren't financially successful as much. They were good, they made money, but they weren't like mega hits. But the JRPG became a viable pop culture phenomenon with the Sony PlayStation. And then retroactively, we went back and re-examined the Super Nintendo and was like, oh yeah, it has JRPGs too. But at the time, it was PlayStation that was introducing people to the JRPG. And one of the better JRPGs that was exclusive to the PlayStation, I don't know if it was made by Sony or not. I didn't research this. But it's a damn good game, and it was very graphically impressive for the time. Legend of Dragoon. This was kind of a sort of westernized take on the JRPG. I say kind of, sort of, not really, but it was marketed kind of like that. And it was kind of a vastly superior counterpart to the Saturn's Panzer Dragoon Saga, which we're going to get into that game when I talk about the Saturn for sure. But spoilers, this is the better game. Number 11, continuing the trend, is another JRPG that was super mega popular, and it was a big hit again because of the graphics, but also was kind of introducing us to the franchise. Not, I wouldn't say introducing us to the franchise per se, but reintroducing us to the franchise and letting us know that each game is its own game. And this is Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII was the first Final Fantasy 3D PlayStation Final Fantasy era game that really said, okay, we can go beyond your expectations for a JRPG. And it absolutely did. Number 10 is another 3D fighting game that originated in the arcade but really found its home on the Sony PlayStation. This is Tekken 3. To this day, not only the best Tekken game ever produced, but I'll go so far as to say the only playable one in the franchise. And I 100%ed this game in an afternoon. Literally, I got this game, came home from school, and unlocked everything and beat the game with every character, and literally 100%ed this game in an afternoon, and I was like, that's it? That's the best you got? It's not a great game, because it's not a great franchise, but it's the best game in the franchise, and it is one of the better 3D arcade-style fighting games on the system, which I am a fan of. I love fighting games. Number 9 is an odd duck, because some people would argue this doesn't belong on the PlayStation at all, because it originated on the 3DO, where it probably should have died. Others would argue it was a gimmicky game, and it was a gimmicky game, absolutely. But it was still a lot of fun. Unfortunately, it uses passwords instead of memory cards, even though the PlayStation uses memory cards. It's a 2D, almost horror-themed platformer. Almost horror-themed. But it's a goofy comedy, sketch comedy type goofy game called Gex, or Gex the Gecko. Now, Gex had multiple games on the PlayStation and Nintendo 64. They were more 3D platformers than this one. But the original Gex is a staple of the original PlayStation, and probably the only game worth playing on the 3DO, if you want my honest opinion. But, yeah, Gex is a fucking good game, and I enjoy it, and I like to tell people to buy it because it's fucking awesome. And where are you going to come across the 3DO, honestly? And don't waste your money on the Saturn version because the Saturn is too goddamn expensive. Number 8 was continuing a trend that was sort of started in the Super Nintendo era with compilations, but really came into their own in the PS1 and PS2 era. And this is one, by far, actually, the best compilation on the PlayStation 1. And it has been updated to this day. It's even on PS4. It might even be on PS5, I don't know, but it will most likely eventually. Because it was on PS2 and PS3 as well. And this is the Street Fighter 2 collection. Now, subsequent video game generations would just collect the entire Street Fighter franchise. But with PlayStation, they did Street Fighter 2 collection, and I think they did Street Fighter 3 collection, but don't quote me on this. But the Street Fighter 2 collection was pretty fucking awesome on the Sony PlayStation. Because, again, we finally got definitive home console ports of the arcade version. And it was fucking great to finally get legit home console ports of the arcade game. Because everything that came before missed the mark in one way or another. Now, number 7 is kind of like Tony Hawk's in that it is not a PlayStation exclusive. It was on Saturn, it was on PC. But it's known as a PlayStation game. And even though it's not produced by Sony and it is on other consoles even to this day, it's still known by gamers as a PlayStation franchise, even though it isn't technically a PlayStation franchise. It's Tomb Raider. That first Tomb Raider was mind-blowing when it released. So much so that it spawned a franchise as well as a film franchise almost immediately. People were like obsessed with Tomb Raider. They couldn't get enough of it. Number 6 is another one that not only gets, again, this is a game that isn't technically a PlayStation exclusive. It was on the Nintendo 64 and the GameCube and ported to every system since in some form or another. More or less. Not literally every system, but pretty much. You know, there's the odd duck here or there, but this game gets ported everywhere. And this is the game that defined the survival horror genre and is still the strongest survival horror franchise to this day. And this is Resident Evil 2, which is, I will not say the definitive Resident Evil, because I would give that to Resident Evil 4, but it is the definitive Resident Evil on the PlayStation, for sure. And if you're only going to own one survival horror game for the PlayStation, which is what I would recommend because most of them suck, this is the one to get. Number 5 is another entry in a franchise I've already put on this list. This one is the first entry in the franchise. This is Crash Bandicoot, which was originally not... It was sort of a PlayStation exclusive, even though it wasn't published or produced by Sony. It was actually Naughty Dog, who would later get bought out by Sony. But it was published by, I believe, Universal, who didn't stick around in the video game publishing world necessarily. There's some weird merger legality kind of IP shuffling going on in the PS2 era. But pretty much Universal as a studio didn't last long as a game studio. This was their crowning achievement. This was Crash Bandicoot. One of the greatest 3D platformers on the PlayStation. I will not say it's on par with Super Mario 64 because literally nothing is. I've already done a video on that. But as far as PlayStation goes, this is the definitive 3D platformer on the console. This is the one you want. Number 4 is a racing game, and as good as the PlayStation was as a console for racing games, because it had a shit ton of them, and this whole list could have been nothing but racing games, if I wanted it to be. This racing game 1 is pretty much the definitive one, at least on the PlayStation. The best one of all the racing games. This is the top dog on the Sony PlayStation. And it's a franchise that continues to this day, and people get excited for and look forward to new entries in this franchise. It was sort of unique in that it was not the first racing game franchise to have officially licensed cars, but it was one of the first ones. But it went beyond just previously licensed cars had been like a single car manufacturer, like a Jaguar game. There was a Cadillac game, you know, things like that. This was like all car manufacturers. And it had pretty realistic physics for the time compared to most racing games. And it made you actually get your driver's license, complete some driving tests before you could race. And it was, you know, all about building your clout and customizing your car and all kinds of fun shit. This is Gran Turismo 2, which Gran Turismo could have been on this list. I could have put them both on this list, but I didn't want this whole list to be nothing but racing games because the PlayStation was pretty much known for its racing games, just like the N64. Because in the early days of 3D, racing games were the only like 3D games that still looked good for the time, whereas all of the other 3D games look so aged and dated today. But the racing games still hold up. And Gran Turismo 2 definitely holds up. I still have Gran Turismo 2, and I still play it to this day. Number 3 is the first in a new style of game known as Metroidvania, and it is the definitive Castlevania. And obviously it's Symphony of the Night. I kind of spoiled it. Symphony of the Night is by far the greatest 2D Castlevania. Probably the greatest Castlevania of them all, but I haven't played all the 3D ones. So I can't say that definitively, but I'll say probably most likely, just because it's the greatest fucking game I've ever played. Castlevania game, at least. It's one of the greatest fucking 2D action platformer, horror, kind of RPG, kind of hack and slash type. It's just a fucking great game. Great fucking music. Not too hard, but just hard enough. It'll challenge you, but not piss you off to the point where you want to throw the console against the wall and smash the controller with your feet, like some of those NES games made us want to do, which is the real true reason everybody got the blinking light on the NES, is because those things got kicked and punched and thrown across the room more than once. I know mine did. Number 2 is kind of an arcade fighting game, but not really. And I say kind of because it's not exactly a compilation of arcade fighting games, but an amalgamation of arcade fighting games. So it's Mortal Kombat Trilogy, and what it does is it takes the ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 arcade game and just adds in all the missing content from Mortal Kombat's 1, 2, and 3 that weren't in the Ultimate MK3 game. So it's like all the characters and levels and fatalities from Mortal Kombat 1, 2, and 3, which is why it's called Mortal Kombat Trilogy. Now, there are 2 versions of Mortal Kombat Trilogy. There's the PlayStation version, which I believe was the basis for the PC port, but don't quote me on this. And then there was the separate but almost equal Nintendo 64 version, which was not as good, but not bad. But the PlayStation version is where it's at, and this is one of the top games on the Sony PlayStation. This was the game that made me buy a Sony PlayStation, next to number 1, which was the game everybody bought a PlayStation to play. Number 1 is Final Fantasy VII, and I don't even have to explain myself or talk about it, because if you bought a PlayStation in the 90s, you bought it specifically to play Final Fantasy VII, because everybody that bought the PlayStation bought it specifically to play Final Fantasy VII. Because it was the game. It was the game of all games at the time. If you want an example of what we call a system seller, this is your prime example of a system seller. And I could talk about it all day long. I could do a whole series of videos on it. I could do a whole podcast, a never-ending podcast on Final Fantasy VII, because it's just that fucking great. And there's so goddamn much to talk about. It is my number 2 greatest video game of all time. Number 1 being Super Mario World. Of all eras and consoles and generations and arcades and everything. So yeah, this is a damn good game. One of the greatest fucking video games I've ever played. One of the few video games that I have 100%ed multiple times, and I've owned it on everything I can own it on. I owned it on PS1. I owned it on PS3, the digital. I did own the Switch version when I had a Switch. I had the remake on PS4 for a time. And I've had some of the spin-off games from this game. Final Fantasy VII is like the game of games. You know what I mean? Like, this is why PlayStation is still relevant to this day. Because this game, like, literally took a generation of Atari and Sega and Nintendo gamers and united us under the PlayStation banner because of this one fucking game. Which, spoilers, should have been a Nintendo 64 game. So, big fuck up on Nintendo's part. Major fuck up on Nintendo's part. But yeah, top 25 greatest PlayStation 1 video games of all time. Stay cool.